Well, good morning, everyone. We're delighted to have you here today to talk about a very interesting and dynamic election cycle. 2022 has already proven to be a critical year for elections, and we know that there are more to come. From the midterms in the United States to the presidential elections in France, Germany, and Colombia, to the state assembly votes in India, and even the Brazilian general elections, voters are casting ballots and making choices which will impact their countries and their leadership for years to come. My name's Everett Eisenstadt. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the chair of North America for Edelman Global Advisory and also the Global Trade Lead. I have the privilege of moderating a very esteemed panel of experts today. We'll briefly go through introductions and then we will begin our dialogue. First, we have Bill Droziak. Bill is a global fellow at the Wilson International Center for Scholars. He is regarded as one of the most knowledgeable observers of foreign affairs. He has served as foreign editor and chief foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, as the founding editor of the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Center in Brussels, and as president of the American Council on Germany. Before becoming a journalist, he played professional basketball in the United States and Europe for 7 years. His highly acclaimed book, Fractured Continent, Europe's Crisis and the Fate of the West, was selected by the Financial Times as one of the best political books of 2017. And Bill has also recently published a new book called The Last President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive France and Save the World. It is getting great reviews, and I am looking forward to digging into that book myself. We also have with us Mohammed Hussain, former United Kingdom government special advisor and political commentator. Mo had a highly successful career in government, serving with the Ministry of Defense as senior press officer for the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, and as the chief press officer for economy and industry. He has also served as a special advisor to the Home Secretary for the UK government. Most recently, Mo served as managing director for public affairs and innovation at PLMR, which is a London-based public relations and public affairs firm. Welcome, Mo. We are thrilled to have you with us today. We will also hear from Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Latin American Center. Jason is a widely respected expert on Latin America with over 20 years of expertise in regional politics, economics, and development. He is an adjunct professor at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he teaches on Central America and U.S. immigration policy. He was previously Director of Policy at the Americas Society and the Council of the America, and the senior editor of the well-known magazine, the America Quarterly magazine. We will then turn to Alyssa Ayers. Welcome, Alyssa. She is the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs and a Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. Alyssa is also an award-winning author with senior experience in government, nonprofit, and private sectors. She has served as a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council of Foreign Relations, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, and her book about India's rise on the world stage, Our Time Has Come, How India is Making Its Place in the World, was selected by the Financial Times for its summer 2018 politics list. So we're glad to have you here, Alyssa. Last and certainly not least, we will hear from Marty Reiser. Marty serves as a senior advisor to Edelman Global Advisory. He is also a principal at S3, which is a Washington, D.C. based government relations firm. Marty recently served as policy director for the House Minority Whip, Steve Scalise. He was the lead policy staff on many important bills that have moved through the Congress since 2014, including Trade Promotion Authority, tax legislation, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the CARES Act, and COVID-related legislation, just to name a few. So we've got a really great panel for you today. I'm excited to dig into and hear from the experts about what's going around in the world and what it means for business. And with that, we'll start with Bill. Bill, you've studied European politics for decades. I suspect that the war in Ukraine and skyrocketing energy prices are top of mind in the voters and certainly influencing some of the elections. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Europe and what we can expect?
Yes, thanks, Everett. Pleasure to be with you. The political agenda is overwhelmingly dominated by the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the consequences for the energy picture in Europe. Just the other day, the European Union Council of Leaders decided on a new regime that will cut off 90% of Russia's oil imports into Europe by the end of this year. that does not deal with the natural gas imports, but oil and gas from Russia account for more than $1 billion a day in revenue for Russia, which fuels its war machine. So anything that Europe can do to slash those revenues to Europe will have an impact on Russia's ability to wage war in the months to come. The political agenda in terms of how this is affecting the likelihood of the elections in the months to come is profound because of the impact on potential recession. Europe, like the United States, is going through a period of elevated inflation. It's about over 8% now, and could rise in the future, particularly if oil and gas prices shoot up as the European nations cut off their supplies from Russia and have to scramble elsewhere to find supplies. So that is going to drive energy prices up and thus have an impact on inflation, which of course worries some governments because they fear that they would jeopardize their political outlook. So far, there's been a positive turnout in France for President Macron. He won re-election to a second 5-year term just last month, beating back his arch nemesis Marine Le Pen from the far-right National Rally Party. And he now faces parliamentary elections in June, which will determine whether the coalition of forces that he leads in the French, the broader centrist groups can achieve a parliamentary majority. It's interesting how France has become such a polarized, fractured country, much in the same way as the United States politically. 57% of the voters in France in the presidential election opted for the far right or the far left parties. And this will be the challenge for Macron to win a legislative majority in June. Right now, the polls show it looks pretty good for him. He may indeed get the majority he's seeking and thus be able to push ahead with his economic reform process for France, and also win the approval of French voters to press ahead with further changes with his ambitious agenda for Europe. Elsewhere, we've seen the new coalition in Germany get off to somewhat of a shaky start. The Social Democratic Chancellor Olaf Scholz suffered a setback last month in regional elections in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the most populous state in Germany. But so far, he's been able to hold his coalition together, even though they disagree on many issues. It consists of the anti-nuclear Greens Party and the liberal Free Democrats on the other side. But it will be interesting to see how Scholz moves ahead. Right now, he is turning his back on Angela Merkel's cautious approach and embracing Macron, who says that Europe needs to stand up on its own feet and defend its interests in the world by becoming a much more dynamic and effective power in order to compete with the United States, Russia, and China in an era of new big power politics. But the continuing conflict in Europe rests between the more global, open-minded leaders such as Scholz and Macron versus the far-right populists. We saw that Viktor Orban won re-election to a 4th term as prime minister in Hungary. He continues to be a thorn in the side of other European leaders, most recently rejecting the call to cut off oil imports from Russia a carve-out was established, a compromise, so that that Hungary will be able to continue receiving oil via pipeline, but that all shipping exports from Russia will be cut off. But at the same time, Slovakia turned its back on its populist prime minister and rejected him in favor of a pro-European liberal choice. So now the attention will turn to Italy, which holds national elections next year, and whether or not the right-wing Lega party led by Matteo Salvini can regain power. But a lot will be determined by the economic impact of the war in Ukraine, the rising food prices because of the fact that grain has been blocked from being exported to the world by Ukraine, which is the fourth biggest grain producer in the world, and the scramble for oil and gas supplies that will result from cutting off imports from Russia. So these are forces that will have a profound impact on the political landscape in Europe in the months to come.
Oh, that was great. Thank you, Bill. It shows that those elections really matter. You see what's happening in Germany and France, and then what's to come. So we appreciate your overview, and we'll strive to get back and dig deeper as the program continues. Mo, we're delighted to have you with us here today. Your background is stellar. You've served in government within the United Kingdom in many, many roles. You have a unique perspective on political developments in the United Kingdom. What should business be watching for in the UK? And we'd just love to hear your perspectives on this.
And thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to join you. So the political picture in the UK is feeling quite febrile and quite dangerous at the moment. And this is focused around Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's seen as the ultimate political survivor, the cat with 9 lives perhaps, but this time it feels a bit different. Lots of his own backbench members of parliament are now coming out, speaking out against him. They're not just from one wing of the party. It isn't the usual suspects who have never liked him. It's people on the right of the party, Brexiteers who were his fellow supporters, new MPs, older MPs. So all of these people are now getting quite frustrated with the series, let's say, of unforced errors or self-inflicted wounds we've seen in the UK, not just in terms of lockdown breaches in number 10, parties in number 10, but also policy U-turns. So there is a lot of talk now around letters of no confidence going in. 54 have to be reached for there to be a vote in the Prime Minister. Nobody really knows how many there are except for the one person who collects them, but informed speculation would suggest that we are very close to that number being reached, and there could be a vote in the Prime Minister as early as next week, which then means a lot of uncertainty for businesses, because you will have potentially, if he loses that vote, a leadership race, lots of ambitious ministers, let's say, including people already in his cabinet, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, will all be running for that top job. Their teams are already doing a lot of the behind the scenes work, calling MPs, trying to boost their person's credentials. And that will lead to probably 2 months or so of uncertainty in terms of who will be in charge, how will they take policy going forward. There is also a scenario where the Prime Minister could win that vote. He needs to have 180 MPs backing him. At the moment, if you count people in government, if you count government aides, that gets to about 170. So there is a scenario where he could win that, but the vote is anonymous. So if you have frustrations with the Prime Minister, and a lot of people do, even people that I speak to in government, you may well, under the cloak of anonymity, want to vote against him, which will trigger the leadership election. I think the other big thing in the UK is, and this will be replicated across other territories, other parts of the world, is the cost of living issue, the cost of living crisis and high inflation. You have seen a lot of debate and discussion about what is the right path going forward. Energy bills, particularly in the UK, are going up by record amounts. And the challenge for the government, and the real dividing line, which I think will dominate the next election, is on one hand, in the pandemic, the government intervened a lot in the economy, spent a lot of money. Do they continue that path? Do they continue being a big spend conservative government and raising taxes, which they have, and introducing things like the windfall tax we saw last week on the oil and gas sector, which is not very conservative idea. Lots of Conservative MPs don't like it. They think it's too interventionist. A Conservative government should not be doing that. But the issue is it's popular in the UK. It polls really well. The Labour Party in opposition suggested it. The government voted against it and now have implemented it. And I think this dividing line between left and right and how much the state intervenes and how much they spend is really going to shrink. And unfortunately, I think in some ways businesses will end up bearing the brunt of this, because to hear from a Conservative Chancellor a language around bad business and good business, which you wouldn't really hear from the right in UK politics, I think shows that the way forward is going to be potentially a slightly trickier relationship with businesses that you have to navigate and understand the politics behind why certain decisions are being made.
No, I think that's a really good point, and we're seeing some of that in the US. I'm sure we'll have a touch on that when we talk with Marty. Could you talk for just a moment about what's going on in Northern Ireland?
Yes, of course. So we have some quite seismic results in the Northern Ireland elections recently, with Sinn Féin, which is the pro-nationalist party, getting the most seats. This has now led to political deadlock in Northern Ireland. The democratic institutions are not functioning, they're not even sitting, which is a problem. And the flashpoint is the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is a part of the Brexit deal that the UK government negotiated with the EU. There's been a lot of aggressive talk around the UK government will just rip up this part of the deal and will override it, which has led to a reaction from Brussels talking about stopping the entire UK-EU Brexit trade deal, which clearly, if that were to happen, would have huge impact on the businesses, but also politically and economically as well. I think it's important here to cut through the noise. There's a lot of public rhetoric. The reality behind the scenes is quite different. I think there is dialing down of language, and people are now looking to make changes to the protocol, not get rid of it completely, because the alternative is, when you are facing a cost of living challenge, do you really want to have a trade war with your nearest geographical neighbour? Probably not. It just feels like it's a bit of a EU bashing is a bit of a pastime for some people in government, some people on the Conservative side, if they want to shore up support from the voter base or from some MPs. I think cooler heads are prevailing behind the scenes. The other point I would make about Sinn Féin is they are clearly a pro-Irish unification party, but it's important to note that they didn't campaign on this really in the last election. They campaigned much more on easing the cost of living. So whilst unification may be back on the cards, I don't think it's going to be in the short or even the medium term. It will raise questions around the union in the UK and what's happening in Scotland with the Scottish National Party. But at the moment, I don't think that's going to be something that Sinn Féin want to take forward imminently at all.
Great, that's very interesting. Thank you. And now we'll turn to Latin America, where we have one of the most sought after commentators on political and economic developments in the region. Jason, we're thrilled to have you with us today. There have been important elections in Chile. We're in the midst of I think, another round in Colombia. And of course, there's upcoming elections in Brazil. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the regions and the impacts that may have on businesses planning going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Everett, and great to be with you and great to be with all the other speakers today. I think what we're clearly seeing across these elections in Latin America is a rejection of the establishment and a rejection of the traditional political class. We've seen that for a number of years, and that is going into hyperdrive as we look at this current electoral cycle. Part of that is sparked by the reaction to many countries' governments' inability to quickly deliver on improving the lives of citizenry in the midst of the COVID pandemic. COVID particularly affecting Latin America hard. 8% of the world's population, over a third of the world's deaths during COVID. And then you have on top of that the implications of the Ukraine war that are impacting, of course, the entire world. but even more so impacting countries in Latin America that don't have the fiscal space to be able to provide the additional subsidies that were done in the midst of the pandemic. So the rising food prices, rising energy prices, inflation in the United States, which obviously impacts all of us here in the US, but has even a more profound impact across Latin America. And so people are generally frustrated, they're angry, and they want their governments to better deliver for their own needs. And so that's what we're seeing play out in these elections. Most acutely in Colombia this past Sunday, in the first round of the Colombia presidential election, which is what we saw was a wholesale rejection of Colombian politics over the last couple decades. The current president, President Duque, has a very high 67% disapproval rating. His predecessor, Álvaro Uribe, latest 55% disapproval. Even Juan Manuel Santos, from a different political trajectory, 54% disapproval according to the latest polls. So you saw a complete rejection of the political class, and that resulted in the two winners of the first round that will go on to compete on June 19th in the second round, both being outsider political candidates, both representing a complete shakeup in the Colombian political system. One being Gustavo Petro, the former mayor of Bogota, who actually competed against Duque, actually made it to the second round in the last election, competed against Duque at that point, losing to Duque in 2018 by about 12 points. And then the other is a former mayor of the city of Bucaramanga, Rodolfo Hernandez, a 77-year-old business person who's an outsider political candidate, one-term mayor of a relatively smaller size city, who has decided not to affiliate with any particular party and really is running on an anti-corruption pledge. So we're going to see, this is important for the United States as well, because we will see a different, whoever wins on June 19th and takes the presidency in August, this will be a moment to rethink how the U.S. and Colombia work together and the keys of that relationship, because both have sought a different trajectory. Brazil is the other critical election this year as well. Lula and Bolsonaro, former President Luis Inacio Lula da Silva and the current President Jair Bolsonaro are the two candidates that will likely make it out of the first round and into a second round. There have been attempts thus far for a number of more centrist candidates. Bolsonaro represents one end of the political extreme and Lula another end, although Lula's tried to more modify some of his image and lead up to the election. But the centrist candidates that have sought to emerge have largely failed thus far. A number have actually already pulled out of the race. And so we will likely see a repeat of Bolsonaro Lula in October. And then you see other leaders that have come into office just this year. You mentioned Chile, Gabriel Boric, who recently took office, second youngest head of state across the world at 36 years old, represents a different trajectory of what the left could represent in Latin America. And then Costa Rica, new president as well, Rodrigo Chavez, former World Bank official, who also is a political outsider, was living in Washington, working at the World Bank, and basically came back to Costa Rica to run for election. So this is what we're seeing across the region. And what will be important is to look at how U.S. policy and also how U.S. business adapt to these changes, and also the degree to which the new leadership across the region, what their perspective is insofar as how to bring in U.S. business, and for some of those key tenets, especially with regard to what business always seeks, which is stability, rule of law, sound investment policies, respecting current trade agreements and other policies.
Oh, that's really interesting. Big changes, of course, if with that potential vote in Colombia, and we'll be watching that closely, as well as Brazil and the new government in Chile, among others. So thank you for that, Jason. I'll just note, I think we'll have time for Q&A. So if the audience would like to populate or have particular questions you'd like to raise, please feel free to send them our way, and we'd like to see if we can address them. Alyssa, you are one of the experts in India for many years. You've watched developments there. You study the region deeply. I know that there's no major elections in India this year, but there have been some local elections that may be demonstrative of some trends that are happening in India. And we'd love to hear your views about the political economy there and where you see it going.
Thank you, Everett. And like everyone else, I'm happy to join this morning's discussion. Let me just say at the outset, since we have been focused on upcoming elections, I wanted to note that in the Indian context, some of you may be reading about upcoming elections this summer for the roles of president and vice president of India. Those have not yet been formally announced, but they have to take place by the end of July. Those are indirect elections for what are non-executive roles in India's system. India has a parliamentary system in which the prime minister and his cabinet form the government. So when you read about the upcoming presidential and vice presidential elections this summer, those will actually not be centrally policy focused. Just a bit of a backdrop, the significant national election that returned Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, which means the National People's Party, and it's known as the BJP in its English shorthand. The significant national election that brought this party back to power with a larger single party majority than they had received in 2014. That took place in 2019. And with this single party majority, it means that the federal central government in India will not be due for another national level election until 2024. So looking ahead in about 2 years, we can anticipate seeing that national election take place, but again, not national level for a couple years. Now, during this calendar year, during 2022, there were some consequential state level elections, elections for state level assemblies that took place in 5 states across several weeks in March. These were elections, again, as I mentioned, for the state assemblies, as well as their chief ministers, which is a sort of governor equivalent if you're modeling on the American system. Those states were Uttar Pradesh. It's the largest state in India by population with more than 200 million people. So it would be a large country in its own right. The state of Punjab, which is a major North Indian state, has around 27 million people. And then 3 smaller states, Uttarakhand, Manipur, and Goa. So one of the important, I think, bellwethers was the results of the election in this enormous and very populous state of Uttar Pradesh. The incumbent BJP party retained power. And I think the lesson of that election was that the BJP's more hardline religious nationalism, some people refer to it as Hindu nationalism, is really personified by the chief minister of that state, who is somebody named Yogi Adityanath. He trumped the opposition parties despite a quite severe impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw an economic contraction across India during 2020, 2021, despite the fact that development in the state of Uttar Pradesh really lags the better performing states of South India. This state's chief minister is often talked about as a potential successor to Prime Minister Modi. And so if that does unfold in the future, if he does become a successor to Prime Minister Modi, it would represent an even more hardline turn to religious nationalism as the party's plank. Remember, in 2014, the BJP campaigned nationally on the idea of development for all. It had a very strong economic message and an anti-corruption message, and that began to shift in 2019. So all of this is against a backdrop in which some concerns for the health of India's democracy are growing. And by that, I don't mean access and polls. I don't mean the process of the vote, but I mean issues like minority rights in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy and questions of press freedom. So this is something to watch. In Punjab, as I mentioned, a newer political party, the Aam Aadmi Party, that means Common Man Party, that party gained power to the detriment of other opposition parties and to the BJP's dismay. This development too is one to watch because this party came to power in Delhi at the state level only in 2014. So Punjab is their next kind of substantial success at the state level in India. Party has prided itself on anti-corruption and governance. We'll see if it can continue to grow. India does have a large number of single state parties who can form consequential governments, can form strong political alliances at the state level. But as of right now, there really is no national level opposition party. It seems to be able to mount a successful opposition to the BJP. Now, what I would note with respect to business interests and people have probably heard this, but it bears repeating, is that India is a federal system. And so knowing and understanding the landscape at the state level is absolutely vital for investment. The central government can and has created national level incentives. They have embarked upon, for the last year and a half, a new series of what they're calling production-linked incentive programs, for example, to try to encourage more manufacturers to come locate or relocate manufacturing operations in India. This is a new effort and a longstanding desire of successive Indian governments to increase the proportion of India's GDP that is contributed by the manufacturing sector. So the success of these policies ultimately depends on the ease of doing business in a particular state, what business somebody might be in, and the opportunities that are available for that sector. I would also note, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, I would also note that in this regard, there is just an ongoing and continued challenge that India faces in employment generation. So job creating investment is of interest to the Indian central government and to all Indian states, as it surely would be in any country, but this really is a longstanding, quite substantial demographic challenge. India has to create on the order of 8 to 10 million jobs per year to absorb those coming of workforce age. The sectors where India has really excelled globally, IT and IT-enabled services, pharma, those are not creating jobs at the scale needed. And this is a really long-standing issue. This just did not happen just in the last couple of years. Unemployment, for example, was at a 4-decade high prior to the pandemic, and the spring 2020 lockdown had just cascading effects on job loss. So India has now moved back out of economic contraction back into economic growth, but it does have to make up for those losses due to COVID, and that has dented the progress of the past decade and a half in growth and income levels. I just would note one other thing on the question of sort of trade and broader strategic engagement. Despite its known and very obvious challenges, India is a major global economy. The Modi government came to power in 2014, emphasizing business friendliness, but that, as it has evolved, has not necessarily fully meant an emphasis on further and deep opening to trade across the board. In fact, we've seen in the past several years a number of tariff increases and a review. The Indian government conducted a review of all of its existing comprehensive economic partnership and trade agreements, feeling that they weren't necessarily benefiting from those agreements. So it's, we're seeing some mixed signals. India has just signed a new trade cooperation agreement with Australia. It's held 3 rounds of negotiations toward an FTA with the UK. It is hard to know how deep these agreements will end up being, as it's been hard in the past to get to a more comprehensive opening. India previously had been part of the Asian Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, but then backed out, feeling that the terms of that agreement wouldn't benefit the Indian economy. It is now on the list of partners for the newly announced Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, when we'll see how that unfolds. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop on where things are in India politically, with the elections, what we might be looking at, and questions of trade and business openness.
It's absolutely fantastic summary of what's going on in the region and the politics, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will certainly be interesting to watch over the next several years as it continues to develop. So hopefully we can get to that. Perhaps not in this webinar, but perhaps we can find another opportunity. Finally, Marty, let's turn to you. There's a pretty important election coming up in the United States. We're in the middle of a presidential cycle. President Obama, boy, that is going back a bit. President Biden is nearing his 2nd year, and that is traditionally a time when the American public tend to send a vote of confidence or no confidence. So now, what are you seeing? Having been through many election cycles, you've got great perspective on this. What do you see coming down the pike?
Well, first of all, thank you, Everett. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I've already learned a tremendous amount this morning. So this is a great webinar. Yeah, I mean, you brought it off right up the top. This is a midterm election of a president's first term. It's likely to be a course correction election. I think, I would start off by saying that's become sort of the normal par for the course in the United States over the last several cycles. If you go back to 2010, this will be the 5th change election since 2010. It will be the 3rd, in all likelihood, change of control of the House of Representatives. And this represents sort of the unsettled nature of the American electorate. neither party has been able to deliver what the American people are looking for on a consistent basis, so that there continues to be a change in power. This goes back even further. If you look probably to 1994, prior to 94, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives for 40 years in a row. There were 20 elections in which they had won consecutively. Since that time, this will be the 18th election, and control has changed 5 times. If the predictions go forward and the Republicans take control of the House, so the American electorate is unsatisfied. And if you look at the polling now, for 2022, we'll get into some more specifics. Over 70% of the American people are unsatisfied with the direction of the country. That's a very large number and does not portend well for the party in power. So this could be an even bigger wave election. In a president's first term since World War II, the midterm election, his party has lost an average of 27 seats. When the president controls both houses of Congress, that average jumps to 43 seats. Now, there's been a lot of redistricting going around, so those numbers are probably going to be muted a little bit. But we shouldn't be surprised to see a fairly big number coming at it. And the specifics of the issues that the American people are concerned about also tend to favor the Republican Party at this moment. I'll bring up 3 right off the top that are impacting things: inflation, COVID, and security. Obviously, inflation, this is going to be the first election since 1980 where inflation is at the top of the voter's mind. I've been out and about this week at different events and lunches and dinners and such. Every single one I've been to, I've gotten a different anecdote from somebody about the impact of inflation. Even this morning in our little pre-session, we were all making a joke about inflation. It impacts every single voter. And in particular, it's a regressive tax, inflation is. It impacts lower and middle income voters disproportionately. That is the voter base that is shifting more towards the Republican side right now. So inflation is going to have a very big impact on the election, and that's going to help Republicans. The second, COVID. Donald Trump, it could be argued, lost the 2020 election because of the way he handled COVID. The American people got hit with a once-in-a-century pandemic. It was they didn't think that he took it seriously enough. The American public has shifted on that. They now want to get back to normal. They're looking back and saying it was probably a mistake. The schools were as closed as for as long as they were. They're concerned about their kids falling behind in education. A lot of people that weren't able to work from home went through the pandemic. They want to get back to normal. So where the Republican Party was probably cost them in 2020, it's going to help them in 2022. Hold on one second. And then so I think COVID is sorry about that. COVID is an issue that is going to help Republicans in 2022. The third issue is security. The southern border is a mess. I think both parties agree with that, have different solutions to what to do, but the American people are showing that they're dissatisfied with where the Biden administration is on the southern border. Also, security is Ukraine and China. The Biden administration has gotten pretty high marks actually on its handling of Ukraine, but it's an unsettled world and people are very concerned about it. China, obviously the American people are concerned about us falling behind and that will impact job security moving forward. So those are issues that tend to be in the Republicans' favor. Democrats, however, have a strong argument to make. We have low unemployment right now, as opposed to where India is. We have a growing economy, and all the fiscal stimulus is still there. So they have an argument to make on the economy. They also have an argument that it's going to favor them in terms of the Roe v. Wade decision we're anticipating coming out in July. The Supreme Court looks like it's going to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that is going to have certainly a significant political impact. How much it's going to shift votes, we'll have to see, but it's probably going to shift votes more towards the Democrats than Republicans. Same on the gun issue. Obviously, the terrible, terrible tragedies. We had another one last night in Tulsa, and the polls show the American people want action on guns and are strongly in favor of different measures that would control and restrict gun ownership in America. Obviously, Republicans have a very different view on that. They're on the wrong side of the overall public opinion right now on that. So I think that's going to have an impact. But when you add it all up, this is an election that's going to favor change. And it's a little bit more difficult to figure out where the Senate's going to be. It's 50-50 tie in the Senate right now. But Republicans are defending twice as many seats as Democrats right now. And that's going to also depend on who the Republicans nominate for their general elections. They have a strong track record of nominating candidates that are very poor for the general election, going all the way back to 2010 and lost a Delaware seat they never should have lost an Indiana seat they never should have lost. So we'll have to see how that all plays out through the primary season. But, you know, they only need to pick up a net of one seat. So they could very well take control of the Senate. And then you're going to have a complete divided government. Congress controlled by one party, and obviously Biden with the executive branch. And that's going to have a big impact on business. The Republican Party and the business community are moving apart. It used to be, you know, the House candidates and Senate candidates that they like to be called themselves Chamber of Commerce Republicans. That's a bad word right now in Republican primaries, certainly. And there's a real schism going on right now between the business community and the Republican Party. And if Republicans take over, there's probably going to be a fair amount of hearings, investigations on what's happening with U.S. companies in China. What are they doing on wokeism and stuff like that? So it's going to be an interesting couple of years. And they're going to also have to begin to address policies around inflation. And, you know, as bad as inflation is, fighting inflation is worse. Those are restrictive policies. And it's the economic policy making is in an uncertain time when you're trying to slow down the economy. It's going to be very, very uncertain, very, very volatile. And I will say, I do think 2022 will wind up being a good year for the Republican Party and a bad year for Democrats. But I don't think it says much of anything at all about what's going to happen in 2024. Because the American electorate, as I said, is unsettled. 2024 is going to be a presidential year. We don't know who's running for president, but if it is, it could, you know, if Trump does run, that's a whole nother set of issues that before the electorate. And I don't think this particular midterm is going to have that much impact on what the 2024 election will look like. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Everett.
That's awesome. Thank you, Marty, for that update. And it's really fascinating to hear the developments around the world and look for, you know, kind of parallels and similarities. A couple of issues have come up. We noted Mo talked about how the differentiation between the two parties, the left and the right, is starting to merge in some ways. We hear that from Marty as it goes with the business sector as well, and also probably regarding federal spending on certain things. We've heard a lot about change elections in Colombia. We've also heard about increasing polarization in many parts of the world, yet in Europe, you know, certain other issues are top of mind, and we've got some fairly traditional candidates like Macron being reelected, and we'll see what happens with his parliamentary elections. And obviously the changes in Germany are very significant. So it's a very, very good review, and we got some great questions in the chat. I'm going to ask a couple, and I'm just going to throw them out for a round robin before we close. They're similar and different. The first is, what synergies do you find in all the electoral processes that you have explained? Are there any global trends in these local contexts? And that, I think, would be very interesting to hear from each of you. And then the other question, and something that has not come up yet, but I'm sure is part of the political discourse in many countries, is China's looking to expand their sphere of influence around the world. What impact does that have on local elections and what to watch for? So we got two thoughts: synergies that you may see by listening to your colleagues, and second, role of China and how that impacts domestic elections and geopolitics. And we'll just start where we started. We'll go with Bill first.
Thanks, Everett. I was struck by Marty's reference to a statistic that 70% of the American people are unhappy with the direction of the country. And I think you could extend that sentiment to many other Western democracies that, as the question about synergies poses. I was struck by how France has weathered the pandemic rather well under Macron's leadership. 86% of the people are vaccinated. The economy is doing well. It's the fastest growing economy in Europe, and they have the lowest unemployment rate in decades in France. And yet there's this disdain for President Macron. He's not a beloved leader by any means. A lot of people held their noses and voted for him because they didn't want to vote for Marine Le Pen. In a way, it's a reflection of the disenchantment that French always seem to feel with their leaders. French writer Sylvain Tesson once said, France is a paradise inhabited by people who think they're living in hell. And I think that that is shared somewhat in other countries. Already the polls in Germany show that the Christian Democrats under their new leader, Friedrich Merz, have rebounded in the polls anyway to a leading position if elections were to be held, let's say this month, that over the current incumbent Olaf Scholz. So I think it's hard to explain why, even in countries that are doing relatively well, that the general population feels disgruntled with their political leadership. But maybe it reflects the continuing forces of globalization that have fractured the society and the United States, France, and elsewhere. And leaders have not come up with solutions that appeal to the voters.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Mo?
I think in terms of synergies, there's a question around the role of the state and the size of the state. During the pandemic, it feels like people got used to the state perhaps doing things it wasn't doing before, governments getting even more activist in people's everyday lives, spending a lot more money. And certainly in the UK, we're seeing the government trying to stop doing that. It's just not working. And I think there's a real question around what do people expect from the government? Is the taxpayer the first port of call for bailouts for different business sectors, for example? And I think that will continue because people have shown that it can be done, that help can be there if it's required, and it's quite hard once the genie is out of the bottle to put it back in that way. I think there's also a question, if you look at Australia or Germany, Scandinavia even, a slight move to the centre left. The UK does feel a bit of an outlier in terms of centre-right government at the moment, but that just seems a trend that seems to be happening around the world as well.
Great, thank you. Jason, what synergies do you see from our dialogue this morning?
So I'll three synergies, and I agree with previous speakers, and I'll take on the China question quickly as well. I think first, extreme polarization, right? I mean, this is something we've seen for quite some time in Western democracies, and that's playing out even more so in 2022 with a disenchantment and citizenry countries around the world, and that relays itself then to a dissatisfaction with the political class, right? So being an outsider is the key way to try to win office. Never always try to say discard any type of political experience you've had, and that's a stronger route to potentially winning office. And third is this gravitational pull toward outsiders, toward experimenting with the unknown. Because of this dissatisfaction with the political class. I would say on the China front, I don't see a role of China in the elections per se, but an incredible role of China in policy making. And that particularly plays out in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think it's an really important point, is the global geostrategic competition between the US and China is front and center in our own hemisphere. And over the last decade, China has become the largest trade partner of all countries in South America except for Colombia. China's growing influence, investment influence, cultural influence, trade influence means that countries no longer have alternatives to U.S. business, have alternatives to U.S. The U.S. relationship, which gives an additional opportunity to ink out a trajectory that might differ from what the U.S. prefers. And so we're seeing that not in the elections, but in the way that policy is determined and the way that policy is implemented increasingly across the region.
Thank you, Jason. Alyssa?
I'd like to actually pick up on the China part of the second question, because I think there's a little bit more to say about that. Synergy's question is tough because India is so big and there's so many diverse political strands. So you can make many different arguments about different types of synergies that may be true in one place and be less true in another. But the China scenario is actually quite important. So let me just revisit this. Again, there has not been a national election in India since 2019. And typically foreign policy or national security issues are not front and center in India's national elections unless there's a major national security issue, as was the case in 2019, where there had been a recent cross-border terrorist attack, and the preoccupation of a lot of the campaigning was focused on Pakistan and India-Pakistan and the terrible relationship between the two and the threat of terrorism from Pakistan. So if we fast forward, again, no national election due until 2024, but it wasn't that long ago. In fact, it was about 2 years ago in June 2020 that there was a fatal standoff between Indian and Chinese troops on the India-China border. And this is a border that remains undemarcated following the 1962 war. It means that there are constantly incursions across both sides. But the clash that took place really from April till June, and then the clash in June 2020 resulted in the deaths of about 20 Indian troops and an unknown number of Chinese troops. It was a quite brutal sort of clash, hand-to-hand combat on top of these very high ridges. And some of the soldiers simply fell to their death in this icy cold Himalayan environment. This clash and the border remains a problem. There are continued standoffs around the border. They've had more than 20 rounds of border talks between India and China. Again, no resolution. So we'll have to see if there are any other flare-ups during the course of the next couple of years, but this remains a live national security challenge. There is a debate in India about the extent to which the Indian government acted successfully in pushing back Chinese troops or in detecting the kind of infrastructure buildup that China is embarking upon along the border. Of course, India is also very focused on being kind of the one country that is standing up to China in an actual combat situation. And so this is a common national security electoral question that I believe will remain on the front burner to some extent and could become an even more important issue depending on whether there are continued or a worse flare-up along the border in the years ahead.
Yeah, well, I remember that was pretty brutal. You described the very, very difficult situation there. Marty?
So, for the synergy question, I would start with the Edelman Trust Barometer, and you can see if you go and look at that data, which goes across the globe, voters are very unsettled. They're very untrusting of government and current policies, and I think it goes to what Bill was talking about. Voters across the world right now are dissatisfied with the solutions they're getting from their governments and their politicians. And I think that is a trend that is weaving throughout this discussion today. And these are difficult issues, and China highlights that. What are the policies that are going to deliver for the majority of people when you're dealing with something as complex as China? I'll start, real quickly on the Republican side. There are China hawks who are now ascended in the party versus what had been the corporate side of the party from the 90s and the early 2000s of integrating with China and helping corporations get into China and develop the economic relationship. Now, the ascendant people in the Republican Party are more national security oriented towards China, and they want to confront U.S. businesses, frankly, and what they're doing in China, and allowing their IP to be stolen and disregarding some of the human rights issues. On the Democratic Party, you have a similar type of schism of should they be confronting human rights? Speaker Pelosi has a long history of being very critical of China on human rights issues and being willing to use sanctions to address it. But the progressive wing of the party is also much more concerned about climate change and wants China's cooperation in climate agreements, and so is less willing to confront China on some of these issues. But moving forward, what does American policy do that is going to help the American voter in terms of the things they care about, particularly economic security and economic optimism? Those issues are very difficult from a policy perspective. Should we be doing more to integrate with China? Should we be moving jobs out of China? And if we're trying to move them out of China, are we trying to move them back to the US? Or are we trying to move them to more friendly places? Those are very complex, and it's going to play out over a long period of time.
Those are great points. Well, this has been a really outstanding review of some of the major elections. We didn't even hit all the elections around the world, but what we've touched on have been very insightful and given a perspective of the different political dynamics in different regions of the world, but also demonstrating some of the similarities. So it was a fantastic opportunity to dig in on this. And I'll just note a couple of things that I heard. There's been a lot of shocks to the system. Obviously, the pandemic and COVID have really tested the political cultures in many countries. And the heels of that, we now have, inflation driven by both, high energy prices, but also stimulus spending in other parts of the world as governments now try to pull back from stimulus spending. What does that mean for their ability to deliver to their constituents? And then, of course, we have the war in Ukraine and the food shortages that I think we'll see becoming even more and more of a prominent issue and of concern. We're seeing it here in the United States with just a baby formula shortage, but also I suspect we'll see other parts of the world that are going to be impacted as well. Marty, you mentioned a really good point on the Trust Barometer. One thing, we just released a study a couple of weeks ago, I believe, that talked about how many consumers are losing confidence in the ability of government to deliver, and that's coming through in some of the discussions we've had here today. And they are increasingly looking to business to step up and speak up and be part of the solution. So for all the clients out there and business operatives, in addition to your day job, I think you're now being expected to do more. So it's a changing environment, a dynamic environment. We're really blessed to have this group with us here today to help us understand it. So again, I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank Bill, Mo, Jason, Alyssa, and Marty for giving us their perspectives, and just hope that we'll be able to revisit this and gain some more insights as the days continue. So again, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.